curious about what city, what technology?
I'm curious about the cities of the future and how the cities were in a 5-year time, 10-year time, 20-year time. Because I think no one has the answer. No one knows where we will be.
In this episode, I'm talking with Dr. Estefanía Tapias, an ETH alumna, a future cities expert. And we're going to talk about her path from ETH Zurich and the Singapore Future Cities Lab to work today, based in Dubai, focused on advising cities and places on smart and sustainable development in her role as head of smart and digital for WSP in the Middle East. This is the We Are ETH podcast, and I'm Susan Kish, your host. Good morning, Estefanía Tapias.
Good morning, Susan. I'm currently in Dubai, so it would be the afternoon for me at the moment.
What do you think makes Dubai and sort of the Middle East a place of interest? I just read yesterday that the CEO of Revolut, the cool digital money company, just moved to Dubai. It seems to be pulling a lot of interest, especially in the world of technology.
Yes, especially, so the Emirates, they are investing a lot in technology and really pushing that. It probably feels like Singapore 15 years ago, where they were pushing and investing a lot on digital development. And it's very interesting. Of course, there's a lot of things that are pilots or are not working or didn't end up working, but that's the whole process. But you can see in the day-to-day life of anyone that they are really pushing into innovation, and that's extremely interesting. Then we have Saudi, which is the country that is really pushing a lot of development from the ground at the moment. And that it's also very interesting because they're investing a lot, especially for my field in cities, districts, buildings. They're putting a lot of effort on that. They're building cities from scratch.
How did you get interested in cities?
I studied architecture and I was always with the focus on cities. So I did my last years focusing on urban planning and cities. I also did architectural engineering in my master's. So from there, I combined my love of cities and urban planning with technology. And when I landed at ETH, I wanted to do a PhD that combined the two worlds. And then on top of that, I could do something for sustainability. So that's how I worked with urban climate and sustainability. But with the framework of a smart city, how can you use technology and data-driven approaches for advancing cities in the future? And so it was just a combination of all the things that I loved from the beginning. And I just put them together in my PhD when I was at ETH.
I remember reading about the mayor of Bogotá, who put in place some really interesting urban transportation systems, which he used as sort of a foundation as he developed the city.
This was probably at the end of the 90s, beginning of the 2000s. They implemented a transportation system that was in between public buses and metro lines or trams.
Exactly right.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it was very innovative back in the days. And I think that if you look back, it actually works quite well. So yeah, I think that's the one you're referring to, right?
Yeah, it is. And I bring it up because he was the one who said the definition of a fabulous public transportation system is when everybody, irregardless of their economic situation, when the rich take the tram, basically, is what he said. And the public transit system in Zurich, he always held up as an example of that because it was so seamless, so easy, so safe, and so secure. How did your years in Zurich influence your work around urban planning and sustainable cities?
So it's very interesting because the first time I heard about Zurich was in a talk from this very famous architect and philosopher, and it was a talk when I was in Torino.
He's Dutch.
Yeah, he's Dutch.
Right?
Exactly. And in one of his books, he wrote that the very interesting, so it was about urban sprawl and how cities evolved in very different ways. So you have the horizontal, the vertical way of doing it. But when it came to Zurich had a very interesting approach, which was very organical, that it grew from within. So it was basically recycling all the different interesting corners, spaces, and so on. And that was actually the first time I really had my eye on Zurich. And I thought it was very interesting. And then the opportunity came. Of course, ETH is a very renowned university, and the opportunity came to do my master thesis abroad, so outside Italy. And then of course, the first thing I wanted to do, I wanted to go into research. I wanted to go into ETH, and also because of the city, because of Zurich. And when I did my first interview, I went to Zurich for the first time. And I fell in love with the city. Still today, it's my favorite city in the world.
Really?
It's the perfect combination of nature, of development, of cleanness, of safety, of modernity. It's really amazing. And it's also very technological, but not too much. So it still keeps a little bit of the culture. It still keeps a little bit of this essence of a village without being a village, without really with having everything. So the first time I thought to myself, I need to stay here. This is so beautiful and fantastic. And then I moved to Zurich just for 6 months to do my master thesis. And then it ended up being 8 years. I ended up also marrying a Swiss person. So, my daughter is Swiss now. So yeah, it just came all together very nicely.
So when I think of urban planning and where you choose to do your PhD, I have to say Zurich and the ETH wasn't in the top 3. I would think of many of the big urban planning schools around the world. Why did you pick ETH? What was it about ETH that made you, in addition to falling in love to the city, what was it that made ETH your choice?
Well, the city is one. Second, the professor I work with. So he is renowned. He's already retired.
What is his name?
Gerhard Schmitt. And in the field, he's a very renowned person. And as a career, it's very impressive what he has done. But as a person, after 15 years, I know him. Still today, he's the most visionary person I know. It's just like that. He was the one who envisioned the whole Future Cities Laboratory in Singapore. He was the director for a long time. He was the one who was pushing things out of the box, doing things differently. And for me, he's a fantastic person, and I will always be very grateful I had him as a first boss. And then also the lab he created was quite innovative for the time. This intersection between urban planning, cities, urban science, technology, data-driven approaches. This was and it's still very innovative in many ways. And this is how I chose universities. On one hand, the city, Zurich, Switzerland. On the other hand, the person I was going to work with, the lab I was going to work with, was very important for me.
Very, very cool. So let's drill a little bit into the intersection of cities and where you are in the Middle East, which raises this question around heat, right? Heat is one of the prevailing issues in any seat and its planning. Can you talk about your work around heat and why you picked heat?
So when I was working with urban climate back in the day when I was doing my PhD, I did understand that there was a big need to understand the adaptation part of climate change, right? Because on one hand, we have the mitigation, but the adaptation part was key because there needs still an increase of climate and of heat, that it's inevitable. And we need to understand how cities need to adapt to that. So that was one of my motivations going into the topic. But back then, I didn't really understand the importance as much as I do at the moment. And one of the reasons was because I had never stepped into such an extreme climate like the Middle East. Back then, I worked a lot around it. I had case studies in Colombia, in the tropics, which the heat was intense, but still bearable. And I looked a lot into heat adaptation. So from a human and physiological point of view, how people adapt to the weather. And also because here in the Gulf, even without the Gulf, there's a lot of different type of climate. So for example, here, Dubai is very humid at some point of the year. And it's very hot. But if you go inside in the desert and you go into Saudi, for example, it is completely dry and warm. So it's a very different type of weather. And when I came here, I understood, okay, this is important. This is important for the people that live here. But on the other hand, I also understood that the adaptation part of the human we cannot underrate it. You get adapted so much to a weather like this. So I give you an example. The summer where I arrived in Dubai, it was so unbearable that I was thinking, I cannot do this.
I can't live here.
This summer that passed, I realized, actually, it's not that bad. I got adapted to the heat.
It's 110 degrees.
Yeah, exactly. So this was something very interesting that I had to learn just by me. And then the other topic around, how do you work around as a expert and scientist around this topic of climate change, the weather, the heat, and so on. You also need to understand that these cities here in the Middle East, they have their own traditional ways of approaching the heat, which has been from the past, from where they were small villages and so on. And there are some parts of the cities that still work like that, especially like the center parts and the traditional historic places. But when it comes to, they also want to evolve. They also want to become these big hubs in the world. And the only way of doing that is building skyscrapers, building big buildings and so on. And I do think that initially, and maybe still today, they don't take so much into account, how can we do a very sustainable building in this heat? So nowadays it's full on AC, everything. But I think there's a huge opportunity to try to think about how to do it in a way that you take advantage of the sun to generate energy. You take advantage of all the things that you have from an environmental point of view to make a building more sustainable. And I think in Saudi, they are trying. Now there's this really, and it's all through technology. They are really trying to figure out, how can we make buildings not only just full of air conditioning, but also how can we implement technologies that will make the buildings, yes, efficient, but also not so disruptive. It is the interest that there's a momentum. And I also think that's why I wanted to come here, because it's very easy to criticize something when you are not here, when you're not in the place and when you don't know about it. And I know there's a lot of criticism about how the Gulf does its things. But before criticizing anything, I wanted to leave it. I wanted to experience it. I wanted to see, fine, problems, but let's come and solve them. Let's come and see if there's something that we can do about it, not just criticizing the way things are being done. So this was a very long answer.
What do you think are the cities that are addressing these challenges around adaptation, around resilience, around responsiveness? What cities are you looking at? And then I want to ask about what cities, how does this intersect with these brand new cities that you described?
So the cities, like currently in my job, in the past I've worked with cities around the world, but it's more interesting to work with the cities that have a lot of challenges, because that's where you can bring the biggest value. That's also the reason why I came into this region. And it's also, I think I mentioned this before at the beginning, in my lifetime, I will only have this opportunity of a big country building cities from scratch. So the good thing about that is that you learn from experience from other cities. You learn from all the best practices, the things that work, the things that didn't work, and so on. And that's very interesting, because then you can apply it for a city that is built from scratch. But on the other hand, you also have a lot of challenges of building cities from scratch, because it has never been done in the past, I don't know how many 100 years. But it's the first time we built a city with technology, with having the advance in technology we have today. And I think Singapore was a good example of, because Singapore was also built from relatively, until a certain point, from scratch. And that was a very good best case and best practice, because they did it very well in many ways. Of course, there are things that also didn't go the right way, but this is how it goes. And from Singapore, we could learn a lot. Actually, when we were working also at ETH, we could learn a lot about a city that was really pushing building a city almost from scratch, but with the advancing technology that we had at the moment. And now in Saudi, I think they are learning from that. I think the Emirates did it at some point also, But now that Saudi is really pushing to that direction, and it's really with a lot of budget, a lot of energy, a lot of effort, a lot of momentum, I think they have learned also a lot. But now they are having a lot of challenges because we haven't done the way they are doing it, never in the past. There are a lot of mistakes they make, and it's normal. And are mistakes that are very interesting to see, actually, are mistakes that are nice to have, also to learn for all the future cities that they want to build and so on. It is very interesting. But again, going back to your question, I think it's better to work with cities that actually have big challenges, so you can actually do a lot around it.
What is your engagement in NEOM? Is that the city that you're speaking of? That huge
This is
brand new
one
development
region,
in
yes.
Saudi.
But in Saudi, there are many. It's not only NEOM. So NEOM, I worked in the past in another, not in my current company, but in another one. So it's like 5 different cities, basically. And they do have, some of them are successful. Some of them are not as successful as they should have been. Just to give you an example, there is this part of the port, the Oxagon, that they are building a new port, that it's one of the projects of NEOM that actually works quite well. It's functioning. That project, I mean, no one talks about it because there's nothing bad to talk about it, basically. So that works. There's this other.
It works. Ships come in.
Yeah. And of course, they are still finishing building a lot, but it is going in the right direction, let's say. Then you also have another project that is called Sindala, which is the island, the touristic island, like the high luxury island that they have. That has been completed also. Of course, it had a little bit of bumps in when they opened it and so on. But I mean, which hospitality project doesn't have bumps at the beginning? And this was a huge one with a lot of ambition, but it's open. It works. Right. It was finished. And then you have the big monsters that were promoted quite a lot. And then they had a lot of difficulties, like the line, for example. It had a lot of challenges and difficulties. It was very, very ambitious project. But I do need to say, I mean, I did had a lot of mistakes, I would say. And it was a bit too ambitious, and you can say all of these things. But one thing I think that was a good outcome of that whole exercise is that it was and I tell you this because when I was working at a software company, I was working at Dassault Systems, the only way the R&D team was pushing for development of the software was because we had projects coming in from these very ambitious projects in Saudi. And if we hadn't had this coming, the technology would have not been developed that fast. And it was an opportunity to push competition in terms of technology. It pushed competition in terms of different vendors competing with each other, really trying to reach into more sophisticated technology, more detail, more aligned. And I'm not talking about AI. I'm talking about the technology that actually helps build the cities. And in my opinion, that was a good outcome of this type of projects because they needed very advanced technology to make it happen. And if it wasn't from Saudi and if it wasn't for all these investments, there's no other part of the world that will be pushing the needle in that sense.
So when you think back, I'm going to go back to the question around Zurich and ETH. So if you had a young person who just finished their undergraduate, they were really interested in pursuing a career in, like yours, around cities, what would you advise them to do?
I will give the same advice that one person gave me back in the days when China was developing like crazy. That teacher or that lecturer was telling us, guys, if you want to work on cities, if you want to work on smart cities, the cities of the future, be flexible, move to these places and live it and work with them and study them and try to get into the places where you will see the change happening. Don't stay where you are. Don't stay comfortable. And I think that has been my life. So I've always tried to move where things are moving, where things are happening. I think that was also the decision of why I moved to the region, a very controversial decision for many people. But I don't change this decision for anything. I've learned in these 2 years that I've been in Dubai and in the Gulf, I learned
Sounds like you've learned so much.
So much.
We'd love to close by asking some questions we ask all of our guests. One of those to start with is when you were growing up and a little girl. What did you want to be when you became an adult?
I wanted to be an artist.
Wow.
But then afterwards it evolved into architecture, and then afterwards it evolved into technology, and afterwards it evolved into cities. So it's not very far away from where I started, but yeah, that is the truth.
I think I read an anecdote where you say your father heard that and he was trying to nudge you into another profession.
That's basically what happened.
What are you curious about? What are you learning about today?
I'm curious about learning new things. I'm curious about new challenges. I'm curious about new cities.
Like specifics, like you're curious about
I'm curious about the cities of the future and how the cities were in a 5-year time, 10-year time, 20-year time. Because I think no one has the answer. No one knows where we will be. It's very difficult to predict how cities will evolve, how systems in cities will evolve, how we will make things in the future in cities. So I'm very curious about that. I would love to have a machine that takes me 10 years forward and I see how cities are working and then coming back. I'm very curious about that, future cities.
What are the books that you're reading right now?
I read recently Invisible Woman because it had to do with how data has been created in the past that has only been based on men.
Comes up a lot.
Yes. I think that's very interesting because it's not only applicable to gender, it's also applicable to different cultures and so on, how in the past we only took information from a specific group and then we created technology out of it. And then the end goal is a very biased product. And that applies to any technology, right? And how we need to be very diverse in how we collect the data, especially now in the age of AI. I mean, this is so important at the moment. And how you collect data, what the maturity of the data, the quality of the data and everything. I think I wanted to read this book because someone told me, okay, if you're very interested about that and also you're a woman, like read the book because this is not the whole story about technology and it's not focused on technology really, but it's really around this concept of it is going towards that direction and it's very dangerous in that sense.
Good. Now, I think you've already answered this question, but the last question we usually close with is where do you like to have a coffee when you're in Zurich?
Next to the lake, in front of the lake.
So just across from Berkeley Platz, where all those swans are next to the bridge.
Yes. And you see the mountains full of snow. Oh, beautiful.
Yep, it really is. Thank you, Estefanía. We've had a great dialogue with Estefanía about her path from growing up in Colombia to going to school in Turin to living in, working, and getting her PhD in Zurich, and now in the professional world, most recently in Dubai. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
I'm Susan Kish, host of the We Are ETH series, telling the story of the alumni and the friends of ETH Zurich, the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology. ETH regularly ranks amongst the top universities of the world in terms of its cutting-edge research, its science, and its people. The people who were there, are there, and will be there. Please subscribe to this podcast and join us wherever you listen. And if you enjoyed today's conversation, give us a good rating on Spotify or YouTube or Apple. I'd like to close by thanking our producers at LE Media and ETH Alumni, and also to thank you, our listeners, for joining in.